We are preparing to go live stream, and here we are. Um, so good evening and welcome to this week's Parsha in My Life. This week's portion is the portion of Chukas. And we're taught that Chukah, the great story of this week, is the story of Miriam. Miriam's passing, a lot of great things happening this week's Parsha, but we begin with on a lighter note. They tell the story that this teacher looks at Johnny and says, Johnny, if I give you two cats and then another two cats and then another two cats, how many would you have? Johnny looks up at the teacher. He says, seven. The teacher says, no, Johnny, listen carefully. If I give two cats, another two cats, another two, how many would you have? He says, seven. So the teacher says, let me put it a little differently. If I give you two apples and then another two apples and then another two apples, how many would you have? Johnny says, six. Good. So the teacher says, now two cats, another two. How many do you have? Again, he says seven. The teacher says, Johnny, where do you get seven from? Johnny says, because I already have a cat. Anyways, reaching out at the end of a job interview, the human resources officer asks a young engineer who's fresh out of MIT and says, what starting salary are you looking for? And the engineer replies, in the region of 125 grand a year, depending on the benefits package. So the interviewer inquires, he says, well, what would you say of a package of 5 weeks vacation, 14 paid holidays, full medical and dental, a company matching retirement fund to 50% of your salary, and a company car leased every 2 years, say a red Corvette? So the engineer sits up straight and says, wow, are you kidding? And the interviewer replies, says, yes, but you started it. So in this week's Parsha, there is the entire nation of Israel reaches the Sin Desert in the first month, and the people camped in Kadesh. Just like there's a town of Oxford, of Southbury, of Litchfield, there's a town called Kadesh. And the people camped in Kadesh, and it was Miriam died and she was buried, and there was no water for the people, and they gathered against Moses and Aaron. Now the Jews were dreading that they'll all perish by thirst. And that's when the story of the striking rock occurred. And God told Moses to speak to the rock so it emits water. Moses, however, struck the rock and it produced water. So what is most perplexing is the introduction to the story about the water, the death and burial of Miriam. How does it come in here? Now, the Torah itself seems to characterize the death of Miriam as an introduction to the following story about the lack of water. First of all, note the letter, there's a letter Vav, V'lo, which means and there was no water for the people. So the and seems to connect the events that go forward. The lack of water for the people with a preceding event, the death of Miriam. But what does Miriam's death have to do with the fact that there's no water here? So as it turns out, that's precisely how the Talmud, the Medrash, and the commentary Rashi understands things. When Miriam passed away, the crisis of the water began. Now, how did they reach this conclusion? So if you survey the entire travels of the people of Israel through the desert, through the wilderness for 40 years, you'll find 3 water crises. The first is in Exodus 15. The second, shortly thereafter, in Exodus 17. And the third, 40 years later, in this week's Torah portion in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. So the very first water crisis in the desert takes place just after the Israelites successfully come out of Egypt and cross the Sea of Reeds. And then the Torah says that they went for 3 days in the desert and they can't find water. So they finally arrive at a place called Mara. There's water there, but there's a challenge. It's too bitter to drink. So this water crisis gets solved when God pointed out to Moses a stick, which Moses threw into the bitter waters, and kaboom, it made it sweet. The next water crisis happens shortly afterward. The Jews arrive in a place called Rephidim, and again they have no water. Now this time things appear to be even more desperate. Moses complains. He says, God, oid ma'atus koluni, just a little bit more and the people are going to stone me. So this water crisis is solved when God tells Moses to hit a rock, and the rock would give water. Now, the interesting thing about water crisis number one and water crisis number two is that they both occur exactly when you expect them to occur. The first crisis happens 3 days after the splitting of the sea. How long could you go without water? About 3 days. The Torah says that when they left the Sea of Reeds, they walked 3 days in the desert and they didn't find water. The second crisis happens again when they continue their journey in the desert, and again there's no water. So these two events happen exactly where you'd expect them to happen. But now fast forward to water crisis number 3 in this week's Torah portion. It's 40 years later. The people are on the cusp of coming into the promised land. What happens suddenly that there's no water? Yes, they're in the desert. But where did they have the water for the last 40 years? And why did the source suddenly stop with the death of Miriam? So the Medrash quoted by Rashi deduced from this juxtaposition a fascinating story. You see, until now, they didn't have a problem with water because they had Miriam's well. Evidently, the rock that Moses struck during crisis number 2 never stopped giving water. It was their portable source of water. That rock became a rolling stone, which accompanied them in the desert for 4 decades. And when did it stop giving water? When Miriam dies. That's what triggered water crisis number 3. But the obvious question is, what's Miriam's role in all of this? And why is this rock called the Well of Miriam? What does Miriam have to do with wells? Now, it's interesting that when God tells Moses in this week's portion to take his staff and speak to, he says, the rock. Now, this sounds a little ridiculous. If I'm Moses and God tells me to speak to the rock, I'm looking around and I say, God, it's a desert here. There's lots of rocks. Exactly which rock do you like me to speak to? A rock, fine. The rock? Obviously, there's the rock, the one that's been providing water until now. Speak to the rock and it will provide water. In the past, you hit it. Now God says, I'm speaking to it. Now, welcome to Shaul Mendel. Now, this mystery deepens when we take a moment to pause and look at just how deeply Miriam is connected to these 3 water crises. She dies in the verse before crisis number 3. Her rock stops emitting water. The rock which Moses struck during crisis number 2 is somehow associated with her. And now, when she passes away, it ceases to flow. But look at water crisis number 1. In the verse just before that, it says, Miriam sings her song at the sea. Now, just before crisis number 1, Miriam sings a song. Just before crisis number 3, Miriam dies. And in water crisis number 2, the rock that Moses strikes becomes Miriam's well. What's the mysterious connection with Miriam? So Miriam's connection runs even deeper. Take Miriam's name. It's made, if you remember the teachings of Hebrew school, the Hebrew alphabet, it's made of 4 letters. Mem, Resh, Yud, and Mem. Now, these 4 letters can make up 3 different Hebrew words. Marim, which means bitter. And if you vowelize it another way, it could mean Merim, to lift up. And if you vowelize it another way, it could mean Morim, rebels. Now, think about these words. Where did they show up? So water crisis number 1, how come they couldn't drink the water? Because the waters were bitter. There's Morim. Same way, Mem, Reshud, Mem. Water crisis number 3, right before Moses hits the rock, he lifts up his hand. That comes from Medim, to lift up. And finally, when he speaks to the people in concert with hitting the rock, Moses says, listen, you rebels. Again, Mem, Reshud, Mem. So every single possible permutation of Miriam's name shows up in the water crisis, in which the first one Miriam sings, the last one she dies, and the middle one, her rock becomes this well. Miriam is ever in these water crisis stories. But why? What is the association and the connection of Miriam to water? So let's go back all the way to the beginning. Where do we meet Miriam for the first time in the Bible? In the Torah. You guessed it, at the water. It tells us in the book of Exodus that the Egyptians were casting Jewish infants into the Nile. In a desperation, the mother of baby Moses placed him in this little box, puts him by some reeds near a shore. And when that happened, it was Miriam, like a good sister. She stood and watched her baby brother near the water. Ultimately, the daughter of Pharaoh retrieved the basket, and it was Miriam who brought the baby's mother to nurse him. Now, if you would have asked Miriam at the Nile, as the daughter of Pharaoh approaches, what's your plan? Why are you still watching? What would Miriam say? I don't know what's going to happen. But just because I can't figure it out doesn't mean there's not a way to get out from over there. There's a master of the universe, and his plans are greater than I could ever imagine. That's the soul and faith that Miriam embodied. Now it goes back even further in time. The Talmud relates that following the edict of Pharaoh to drown all the newborn Jewish boys in the Nile, Amram, the father of Miriam, who is the rabbi, he was the leader of the generation, he separated from his wife. He did not want to have any intimate relationships. He didn't want to bring more children to a world that would kill them. The rabbi does. The other men followed his example, and they stopped having intimate relations with their spouses. What was the point of begetting children if their destiny was a watery grave? Now it was young Miriam, says the Talmud, who spoke up and said to her father, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's. For Pharaoh's decree is directed only against the boys, the male children. But yours is also against the females. No more Jewish children will be born. Pharaoh is a wicked man. His edict may not endure, but you're a righteous man, and your edict will certainly endure. So we're taught that Amram returned to his wife, and all the other men reunited with their wives, and that's how Moses was born. Now, how can this be? Amram is the giant of generation. He decides to separate. How can his little daughter argue with him? Because for Miriam, faith is not abstract. It's not in the books. It's real. You don't have to figure out everything in life. You need to do what you need to do and trust that God will complete the rest. Miriam breathed this truth. And it goes back even further. You see, Pharaoh initially summoned the Hebrew midwives, the Torah tells us. And they had two names, Shifra and Puah. And he instructed them to murder every Jewish newborn boy. Now they rejected the king's orders and made sure the children lived. This is the first record of civil disobedience in the face of tyranny and an immoral regime. The law of God, the law of morality, trumps the law of the king. Now, who was this midwife by name of Puah? We're taught it was Miriam. She knew she might die for this act of treason, but she would not kill the Jewish boys. And what is more, why is she called Puah? Because she would speak to the newborn babies, saying and singing, poo, 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 poo. You thought your bubby started it. It goes back to Miriam. And that's how she calmed and soothed them. So Miriam was not only soothing them in their tears, this was Miriam's calling. She soothed an entire Jewish nation of crying. She inculcated them with faith, conviction, and trust. She calmed them and prepared them for redemption. She gave them emunah, which is why she sings her own special song. The Torah tells us after the splitting of the sea. It says, Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women came out after her with timbrels and dances. Now, what happened at the Sea of the Reeds was a reenactment of what happened to little Moses at the Nile. At the Nile, decades earlier, one child, Moshe, was threatened by one Egyptian, the daughter of Pharaoh, by a small body of water, a river, and there were a few reeds there. Later, the danger would be an entire sea, and there wouldn't just be a couple of reeds, there would be a whole sea full of reeds. And it wouldn't just be one Egyptian threatening just one person from Israel. It would be an entire army of Egyptians threatening an entire people of Israel. That would happen at the splitting of the sea. And just as Miriam had been there the first time, so would she be there the second. And just as she would inspire with the faith the first time, so she would do it the second time. And the Torah tells us the first time that she stood there from a distance and she watched with faith that somehow it was going to work out. So too the people at the sea, they stand and watch. And indeed the same words. In the Torah, it says, by the splitting of the sea, it says, Moshe tells them, just stand and watch. Have faith. It's going to work out. Miriam taught them how to do this. Her example at the Nile taught it at the Sea of Moses, said, stand and watch, have faith. It's what Miriam did. That's why when the people do have faith and the sea splits, Miriam sings a song. She taught them how to do this. Of course she's going to sing. So later, Moshe will be threatened by water yet again. He says, they're so desperate for water, they might stone me. God says, relax. It's going to be okay. He tells them to hit the rock, and the rock becomes, of all things, Miriam's well. Miriam saves him one more time. You see, for 40 years, Miriam's well sustains everyone. It's just not just a physical well. It's the vibrant inspiration and faith that Miriam sustained the long journey in the desert. You know, around 60% of the body is made up of water. Our blood is 90% water. And 71% of the planet's surface is actually covered by water. We can't live without water. We can't live without trust, faith, and conviction, especially when we're in the wilderness. Now, blood is more than 90% of water, and blood carries oxygen to different parts of the body. Water then gives oxygen to all our body parts. And water also dissolves minerals and nutrients, making it possible for them to reach different parts of the body. And it also helps remove waste products, for water is essential to the kidney functioning. Now, what does this represent spiritually in Northwest Connecticut in 5784? You see, we can have faith in our hearts and souls, but it's the water which allows the faith to spread to all parts of the body, to be integrated into the entire organism. It is the water which allows that faith to become a real reality, to become part of our real lives. And this was Miriam. She was the one who hydrated us from day one, all through the Exodus and wandering in the desert. For Miriam's faith is not just a nice word, a crutch, a ritual. It's real. We can live with it, breathe it, rely on it. And this is what Miriam embodied, and this remained her gift to the fledgling nation of Israel. At every juncture was Miriam who stood there with unwavering faith, representing to the people the consciousness and reality of Emunah. You need not always understand how everything will work out, but God is as real as it gets. Rely on him. Trust him. Do what you have to do and let him fill in the gaps, even if you can't imagine how it will come through. In every generation, we have our Miriams, those women and girls who make faith a reality. Sure, in each generation, we had great rabbis and teachers and rebbes, Moses and Aaron, who taught Torah, love, and wisdom. Yet it was usually our mothers and bubbies who, like Miriam, kept alive the deep, unbending faith of the Jewish people. The women were and continue to be the one who provide us with the fresh, living waters of Emunah, with the fountains of faith, to hydrate us in the parched deserts and arid environments, in our journeys throughout the wilderness of life. If you reflect on Jewish history, from the beginning of our story to this very day, it was usually the mothers and daughters who maintained the deepest sense of faith. For them, faith was not a subject in yeshiva or a sermon in the temple, but a reality, as real as their chicken soup and gefilte fish. You know, when my grandmother would say, the Eibishter wird helfen, which means God will help. It was not some cultural Yiddish expression that we use. It was reality. As much as you could rely on sunrise in the morning, you can trust that God will come through for you. Reminded years ago, 5 years ago, I think it was, after the challenge with the Chabad in San Diego. And suddenly the vice president paid a surprise visit to the Chabad. It was the synagogue that sadly was a scene of a deadly shooting. And the vice president said we had to come. And he said that your faith and courage are inspiration to the nation. And he said, Karen and I were honored to stop by Chabad, the site of a terrible shooting in April of 2019. But to the Chabad Rabbi Goldstein, he says, your faith and courage is an inspiration to the nation. No one should fear in a house of worship. We will always condemn evil acts of anti-Semitism. We're with you. Basically, he was expressing the concept that at times you go to Hebrew school and the teacher is teaching you about Shabbos, about Passover, and about, Hanukkah, and it's just a subject. It's not necessarily something they live yet, something they practice yet. But when you go to Chabad, the rabbi, whatever they're teaching, they're living. The Hebrew school teacher is living it. This Shabbos, I think of another Miriam and her twin sister. I was just reading last week a story about these two sisters that we know. Mengele was very into twin sisters. And this particular woman passed away in Krakow, an hotel, not too far from Auschwitz. And, there's a famous picture on January 27, 1945, when Auschwitz is liberated. And you got 13 children, some wrapped in oversized striped prison shirts, and they stand huddled together behind barbed wires. And these 13 were among the 7,000 survivors of the lethal concentration camp. 7,000 of the estimated 1.5 million people have been there to die during the course of the Second World War. And this photograph, you see the two sisters, Eva and her sister Miriam. Now, Eva took young people on an annual summer tour to Auschwitz. That's where she was sent as a 10-year-old child. And she passed away July 4th, this time of the year, 5 years ago at 85, at this hotel right near the site of the former death camp. So surviving the Holocaust at age 10 meant that Eva emerged from a childhood full of fear and loss and grief and displacement. But rather than allowing the darkest moments of her life to define her, she moved forward head first into a life of purpose. Eva and her twin sister Miriam were born to a Jewish farming family in Romania in 1934. And when Transylvania region fell to the German occupation during World War II, they were among thousands that were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there, Eva's parents, her brother, and the two of her sisters were led to the death in the gas chambers. But she and her sister Miriam were spared the same fate by the virtue of a relationship. They were twins. Some 1,500 twins were subjected to horrifying experiments by Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was known as the Angel of Death, who believed that studying them could advance Adolf Hitler's pursuit of creating an Aryan master race. Now, Eva shared later how when they arrived to Auschwitz, the chaos was beyond description. A Nazi was frantically searching for twins in large crowds of the Jewish arrivals. And when he noticed the two sisters, he asked their mother, "Are they twins?" And she said their mother said to the Nazi, "Is this a good thing?" And he said, "Yes." So she said they're twins. And the Nazi grabbed them and whisked them away. She says, "I never knew if I'll see my family again." The twins' father, Alexander, their mother, Yafa, their older sisters, Edith and Alice, who had been separated from them upon their arrival in Auschwitz, were gassed immediately upon arrival. She says, Miriam and I were part of a group of children who are alive for one reason only, to be used as human guinea pigs. And 3 times a week, they'd be placed naked in a room for 6 to 8 hours to be measured and studying. It was unbelievably demeaning. Blood was drawn, germs injected in their arms to see how their bodies would respond. And she wrote that during her time in Auschwitz, they talked very little. They starved for food and human kindness. It took every ounce of strength just to stay alive. She and her twin sister Miriam were 10 years old and managed to survive the regular mystery injections from Mengele. And Corey recalled, after one injection, she fell very ill, and she was suffering a high fever. And she saw Mengele at her bedside, and he was laughing sarcastically. And he said, "Too bad. She's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live." So crawling on the floor because she was unable to walk, Cora said she went on to find her sister, who had been injected with a substance to freeze the growth of her kidneys. And she said, if I died, Miriam would have been killed with an injection in the heart because Mengele would have performed a comparative autopsy. She says, when I didn't die, he carried on experimenting with us, and as a result, Miriam's kidneys stopped growing. They remained the size of a child for the rest of her life. On January 27, 1945, the two sisters watched as the Russian soldiers liberated Auschwitz. They had smiles on their faces. They gave us chocolates, cookies, and hugs. That was our first taste of freedom. These two sisters immigrated to Israel. Eva served for 8 years in the IDF, and her sister Miriam died in 1993 from kidney disease. Eva traveled to Germany in 1993 to meet with a former doctor at Auschwitz. His name was Hans Munk, who had been acquitted of war crimes. He accepted her invitation to go with her to visit Auschwitz and signed a document acknowledging the existence of the camp's gas chambers. On the 50th anniversary of its liberation, they stood together before the charred ruins of the crematorium. At that occasion, she also did something many survivors resented. She said she forgives Mengele for what he did to her. And she said later that many survivors call me a traitor, but I didn't do it because the Nazis deserve it. I did it because I deserve it. In 2013, Cora was approached by Rainer Haas, who was the grandson of Rudolf Haas, who commanded the Nazi death camp in Auschwitz for much of the war, and who began to use the pesticide Zyklon B to kill prisoners in the camp's gas chambers. And today, this grandson Rainer is an advocate against the rise of neo-Nazism in Europe. So Rainer had then really gone on a mission to give up his family and Nazi past, and he asked Cora to be his adoptive grandmother. And after meeting him, she consented, and her actions triggered a deeply emotional and fascinating debate. But one thing was clear: this woman was a bulldozer. Her inner sense of confidence, faith, conviction, and her stubborn refusal to hold on to the past were incredibly powerful. We just celebrated the last 24 hours yesterday, 30 years when the Rebbe returned his soul to its maker, and nobody knew what the future of Chabad would look like. But today we see the miracle occur, and with each passing day, the Rebbe's influence grows and increases momentum. So today, too, we're in a deep exile, and we often wonder about the future. But this week's Torah portion, Miriam, as well, beacons to us and gently reminds us to never, ever give up the faith that very, very soon we will greet Mashiach and dance to the future, the ultimate and complete redemption. Let's hope it happens spiritually in our days. Any questions? We want to wish you a very good Shabbos. We want to remind everyone that this week we have a beautiful special Kiddush, 9:30 services, followed by a great Kiddush, schnapps and sushi, cholent and scotch. Sunday morning we have BLT, 10 a.m., and you're out by 10:45. No, it's not bacon, lettuce, tomatoes. It's bagels, lox, and tefillin. So we want to wish everyone a wonderful, wonderful week. Log on to chabadandw.org. /calendar, and you got everything going on. We look forward to seeing you. Until next week, good health to everyone. And thank you, Shaul Mendel, for keeping us all healthy and walking briskly. And a very good Shabbos.